Hello everybody, welcome back. In the last video, we had implemented our login functionality into our login page, and now we can actually log into our application. But there's still a slight issue with the way we're kind of handling the authentication flow inside of our application. So now that we've logged in, that's one part of the problem done. But we have another part of the problem that still needs to be solved, and that is that once we are logged in, how do we get notified that our authentication status has changed? We can see from the function that we use that we're just returning a future void. That means that there's no way to deduce from this function alone that the login was successful or not. And that was done by design. I wanted to use a system for our authentication provider in such a way that we didn't have to, on every page, bake in some kind of authentication logic that kind of made a deduction whether a user was authenticated or not. And then depending upon that, allow us to use that page or not. But what I wanted to do was to have a uniform interface where there was this one piece of code that was responsible for determining whether the user was authenticated or not. And then depending upon whatever the user's auth status was, we could actually change the page that we go to and actually update some information inside of our application as well. So the most logical place was the authentication provider, because one, it's the provider for all sorts of authentication needs that we have within our application. And it also has access to some of the variables or some of the packages that we require to actually kind of implement the authentication logic. So with that said, in this video, what we're going to be doing is that we're going to be implementing a function which is going to allow us to listen to the changes in authentication status for the user that's logged into our application. And then based upon those changes, we can determine what we'd like to do. So with that said, let's get into it and let's see how we're going to be doing that. So in the previous video, we had logged in our user. So now our user is logged in, but we're not moving from our login page to our home page. Part of the reason for that is because we don't have a home page right now, but part of the reason for that is that we're not getting notified that the login was successful or wasn't. So that's why we're going to be implementing that function, which I just talked about, the auth status changes function, which is going to allow us to listen to these changes. So inside of my authentication provider constructor, I am going to be listening to a function or a stream actually that's provided to us by the Firebase Auth package called auth state changes, and then I'm going to be listening to it, and every time an auth state change occurs, I'm going to fire off this function, and this function is going to be doing some important stuff inside of it. For the event, we'll get an very optional user, and what I'm going to do is that I'm going to rename this parameter to user, and then now we can go into our function and start working. The first thing that I'm going to do is that I'm going to check if the underscore user is not equals to null. So if our user is not null, that means that our user is logged into our application. And what I can do is that I can print our logged in. And if that is not the case, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to have an else statement. And here I'm going to say not authenticated. And just for now, we'll remove these print statement later on, but just to show you how this works. Now, if I do command save, open my debug console, restart my application, you're going to see that we get an output from Flutter saying not authenticated. And you're not going to get this because I actually added some code here inside of Flutter before I recorded this video lecture, and I called the sign out function, and then I removed it just to sign my user out. But you don't have to do that. I'm just trying to show you that how this auth state changes function works. So now, as you can see, the auth state changes function is telling us that we're not authenticated. As soon as I go and I put in my email for a user that's registered, as well as a password that corresponds to the correct password, and I click on login, which will call this login using email and password function, you're going to see that Flutter will throw us another debug statement where this auth status changes function is going to be called. And now, since the user is authenticated, the user will no longer be null and will be called printing logged in. Now, the beauty of this functionality is that one, we have a unified interface for where we can put logic that can deduce what to do when the auth state changes, instead of adding code to every page inside of our application to determine whether we're allowed to be on that page or not. Second, it can allow us to update some of the values that we'd like to update for the user on the Firestore database, such as every time the auth state changes and the user logs in, we can actually change the last seen time for the user on our Firestore database to update the last seen time for the user. And another beautiful thing to this approach is that we can also grab every time the user auth state changes the user information from our Firestore database and then put that inside of our authentication provider in a variable. So the next time that we want access to our local user that's logged in, we just have to go to the authentication provider and access the user, and there is no need for us to actually make another call to Firebase and get the data again, and this will reduce our costs as well as improve performance. So it might be a bit overwhelming, but as we develop this functionality, all things will make sense to you. For now, what I want you to understand is this function is just a function that's allowing us to listen to changes that are happening to our authentication state within our application. So now that this is done, what I'm going to be doing is that I'm going to be ending this video here. And now in the next video, we're actually going to be moving towards our database service. And we're going to be adding some cool functions to our database service, which are going to allow us to, one, update the user's last seen time on Firebase, and then we'll see that in action. And then also we're going to be writing up another function, which is going to allow us to actually go to Firebase and then retrieve from Firestore the user data that we had saved beforehand in the previous video for the user that we had just logged in as. So with that, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.